Good morning, church. My name is Pastor Anne Marie, and we are so delighted that you are here with us this morning. We are in an interesting season in the life of the church. We are kind of in an in-between. Next week, we turn our face toward Jerusalem. We begin that walk that starts in Lent, that leads through Jerusalem to the cross and to the empty tomb. But we aren't quite there yet. The last Sunday before Lent, we traditionally celebrate Transfiguration Sunday, based on the text that we'll read together later. But before we do so, I have a question for you all, which is, do you collect anything? Anybody have any collections that they're working on? Maybe you collect stamps or coins. Maybe you're like Pastor Mike and used to collect baseball cards. Or you're like Pastor Mike currently and you collect books. Maybe you collect nativity sets or other fun things. There's a particular thing that I collect. It's not quite tangible, but I do find it helpful, which is I like to collect the lines in sermons that cause people to applaud. Not ones that I do. That wasn't what I was asking for. Thanks, guys. Let me be very clear. I am not asking you all to applaud. But I've noticed in my listening of sermons, in my going to other churches, even here at FUMCC, there are things every once in a while that move us in sermons so much that we even applaud. That is not a necessary reaction. I'm just making an observation. It's one way to kind of get into the human psychology of it. And so I found that usually the things in sermons that cause these reactions are statements about who God is, the nature of God's love, the way God is reaching out to us, and how God always invites us in. Usually. But my favorite line in a sermon that I've ever heard that caused people to applaud, I actually heard a few years ago. And it was a little different. It was on a Sunday, very much like today. I was in between appointments, and I had 2 weeks where I could indulge in this rare treasure of attending church with friends. Now I get to attend church with all of you, my friends, which is wonderful. But on that Sunday, it was the first Sunday of Lent, and I went with my friend to this church, a United Methodist Church in Dallas, and we found ourselves in the pew, and we were waiting for everything to begin. We sang some songs, we settled in, we responded to the word, and then the pastor came up to preach, the first Sunday of Lent. And he said, "I don't think Jesus wants us to give up chocolate for Lent." I have never heard applause like that from a sermon, and I never have since. But clearly there was something that the people responded to in that sentiment. And he went on, of course, to describe the ways that perhaps Christ is offering us something different, that we don't need to set aside perhaps chocolate. What would it look for us to set aside injustice or hurt or hate in this season? People didn't clap as much for that last one. But as we prepare ourselves for this season of Lent, knowing that it begins this Wednesday on Ash Wednesday, that starting next Sunday, we will turn ourselves toward Jerusalem. I wonder what it looks like for us to prepare for that season. What it is that Christ might be calling us to let go of or to make space for in this season of Lent that's before us. So if you never practiced Lent before, Lent is the 40 days leading up to the empty tomb of Easter, the cross at Good Friday, and all that stands in between. It's 40 days, excluding Sunday, when people will traditionally give up something or take on something new, hoping to connect with Christ in a new way. That as we journey with Christ to the cross, we are more able to experience his new life on Easter Sunday. Many people give up chocolate. Let me be very clear, my friends, you do not have to. But in this time of preparation, I wonder what it means that the Transfiguration Sunday, the text that we'll read for this morning, comes right before Lent. I wonder what word it has for us about what it means to prepare for this season, how we might listen to God at work, and where God might be inviting us to follow. So we're going to be in the Gospel of Luke this morning, chapter 9, starting in verse 28. It says, "Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus and Peter and John and James and went up to the mountain to pray. While he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking about his exodus, which he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but as they awoke, they saw his glory in the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, 'Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us set up 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah,' not realizing what he was saying. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud, a voice that said, 'This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him.' When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things that they had seen." So Jesus has begun his ministry. He's gathered together his disciples. He has started to preach and teach and heal. And he's at a turning point in his ministry. This comes at the very end of his ministry in Galilee, and he is about to make that change toward Jerusalem that will lead to the events of Holy Week. But before he does so, he takes his inner circle. He goes up on a mountainside and prays. And some scholars suggest that perhaps Jesus prays all night, and that's why his friends were so tired. Perhaps they were just people with the gift to sleep anywhere. But either way, they awake, and they see something magnificent. They fall asleep, and Jesus is transfigured, a word that means he is changed. Like Moses up on the mountaintop, he experiences the glory of God and is bathed in light. And there he meets with Elijah and Moses, the one who gave the people of Israel the law, as if to say what Jesus is doing, what he has come to do, is fulfilling the law represented by Moses and fulfilling the prophets represented by the prophet Elijah and moving forward the people of God in this story that God has laid before them. And as the disciples wake up, they catch the very end of this gathering. Peter, coming out of sleep, responds that it's good for us to be here. Should we make shelter for Elijah and Moses? Should we spend some time here? And they vanish and are gone. But my favorite moment of this story comes at the very close, as a cloud engulfs Jesus and God speaks from the heavens, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." And it's these words that I really want us to spend some time in this morning. These words effectively end Jesus' ministry in Galilee, and he's starting to turn his face toward Jerusalem. But they are remarkably similar to the words that began his ministry. We remember back several chapters ago, before healings and miracles and many teachings, Jesus was preparing in prayer for something else. He was preparing in prayer to begin his ministry. And after doing so, he goes to John the Baptist and is baptized. And in that moment, we see something similar to what we witness here. the heavens are opened. The Spirit of God descends like a dove. And these words come from the heavens. This is my Son, who I love. In him I am well pleased. And we have these moments kind of bookending this ministry in Galilee. These moments that come as Jesus prepares for something new. And as I was studying this text this week, I couldn't help but notice the difference in those two moments, in the words that Jesus is given. Before he begins his ministry, before he has done anything, before he has gone out and started spreading the word in this formal way, God says, "This is my Son who I love. In him I am well pleased." Before he had said about the work of his Father. And I think it serves as a reminder to us that as we go out in God's love, as we do what God has called us to, we come from that place of God loving us before we begin. That we do that ministry out of love, not for God's love. But then think about the difference that we find in this second moment of transition. In this moment, Jesus doesn't offer those same words of, "My Son who I love, in him I am well pleased." Jesus already seems to know this. Instead, the words he has offered are for his disciples, for us. They say, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." And while this word, listen, comes from the Greek, throughout the Hebrew Bible, there's an emphasis on listening to God. From the time of Deuteronomy to today, persons who practice the Jewish faith will recite a particular prayer all about what it means to listen to God. Coming from that Hebrew word to listen, Shema in Hebrew. And the prayer goes like this: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. And as for you, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." That's how it begins. But it starts with that word, listen or hear, Shema. And it's a special word because it doesn't just mean to listen or to hear. It means to focus or pay attention to follow. It's a word that kind of has two sides of one coin. On the one side is to hear, to listen. And on the other side is to obey. And this change in these words, this message that God has for the disciples and for us on that precipice of the journey that leads to the cross and new life, I think it has an invitation for us about what it means to prepare for Lent, to think about how we want to spend these 40 days. I think it's inviting us to remember that we can prepare for Lent by hearing and obeying. Over the last month, we've talked a lot about what it means to listen to God. We've talked a lot about what it means to tune into God's voice, that it requires our attention, that we can find God's voice in Scripture, in our tradition through the people of God, through our own reason and our experience. As we prepare for Lent, my friends, what's one thing you can do to help you listen to God? Because God will have words for us. Sometimes words that aren't always easy to hear, that require that dedicated focus. That's what we find in our text for this morning. We hear these words from heaven, "This is my Son, listen to him." And it makes us wonder, what are the disciples not listening to? Over the last several chapters, Christ has begun saying things that are harder for the disciples to hear. He's telling them what it means to follow him, that it means taking up their cross. He started to tell them what awaits them in Jerusalem. He predicts that he will go to the cross. And meanwhile, the disciples following this event start to argue about who is greatest. That's why I love the disciples. But my friends, what does it mean for us to listen to Jesus in this season, even the words that are difficult? But as our text reminds us, it's not all that God asks of us, because the other side of hear is obey. I love that one scholar points out that there isn't actually another word for obey in Hebrew. It's just hear or listen. And that's the reason why when the people of Israel aren't taking seriously who God is or what God is calling them to, the prophets might say they don't have ears to hear. Because if they were hearing, they would be following. And the disciples are kind of there in that moment. They're hearing what Christ is saying, but not quite getting it. And for all their lack of wanting to hear what Christ is saying, I can't help but notice that these disciples do follow Jesus. They walk with him on the road to Jerusalem, and they make missteps, and they lose their way, and they catch sight of Jesus again. And by the time Jesus ascends into heaven, having died and risen again, we find that it is his disciples, Jesus' disciples, who are following through what he has asked of them, even in his absence, that they found the other side of that coin. And so I wonder, my friends, what does it look like for you this Lenten season, not just to listen, but to follow? Maybe it means giving up chocolate. You have my deepest sympathies, if that's true. But maybe it means something different. Dare I say, something more. If you were with us last Sunday in the 9 a.m. service, you might remember that Pastor Mike brought up John Wesley's 3 simple rules. These are ways that he interprets what it means to follow after God. He describes that we follow God when we first do no harm, when we do good, when we stay in love with God. And what if this season we started there? What does it mean to you to have your actions in your life rooted in doing no harm to all of God's people, to all of God's world? What does it mean for you to do good, to serve your neighbor, to approach the world in its entirety with love? What does it mean for you to love God? John Wesley's official words for this last rule of his 3 are actually attend upon all the ordinances of God, which is not as cute to say. But it means attending to the practices that keep us in love with God. Worship and prayer and study and holy fellowship and holy communion. What does it mean for you to fix your eyes on God and stay in love with God in this season? As we prepare for Lent, my friends, where is God inviting you not just to listen, but to follow? I've noticed something this week, and I think perhaps you have noticed it too. We get a lot of emails. Do y'all get a lot of emails? And a lot of them come from like my own doing. If you sign up for a certain thing, you get coupons from different stores, and all of a sudden you have like one email that's only coupons, but then you end up using them. There's all kinds of newsletters that we're subscribed to. I recommend our newsletter, it's wonderful. But I came across a different newsletter this week that came from Priya Parker. She wrote The Art of Gathering, released in 2018. And the newsletter that she released was called How to Move from Apathy to Action. And the story that she tells has a particular subheading. She says, we don't need to have all the answers, we just need a place to begin. I'd like to share the story that she relates in this newsletter with you. She says, sometimes the best gatherings aren't the ones that we plan for, but the ones that we create in response to the world around us. She tells the story of her friend Ashley, who had recently moved into her own apartment in St. Louis, entering a different season of life. Just as she was dreaming up a housewarming party to mark this new era, she learned that several places in her city, serving the most vulnerable people, have been greatly reduced due to lack of funding and job loss. She suddenly felt that inviting people over just to sit around a beautiful place felt superfluous. So she pivoted. In lieu of a housewarming party, she invited 20 friends to what she made as the second-story cafe. Her apartment was on the second floor. And so she put together different things that she had made, types of quiche and chocolate chip cookies and blueberry muffins, and she made all her own coffees and all of these simple syrups, and she invited her friends to come be part of this cafe. So throughout the day, she offered pastries and she made coffees. Friends came in and out, and she invited them to donate what they could. And they took all of the money at the end of the day, and they donated it to places that were serving those vulnerable populations. And she said they benefited from and felt what it was to do something, anything, about what they were seeing. So my friends, we have talked a lot about what it means to listen to God. As we prepare for this journey of Lent, I wonder, what does it mean for us to follow? To recognize that we don't have the answers of all that it means to follow after God. What does it look like for us to start somewhere? To listen and obey. Hear the good news, my friends. I don't think Jesus wants us to give up chocolate for Lent. Thank you. Thanks, Brittany. But perhaps God is calling us to something more. May we listen and follow. Amen.